What if I told you that somewhere in Britain, a law could still exist because nobody ever bothered to remove it? Not a law that was recently written by Parliament, but an ancient rule that somehow survived centuries of wars, revolutions, technological changes, and the rise of the modern world. Britain has one of the oldest and most complicated legal traditions on Earth, and that history has left behind a fascinating collection of strange rules, outdated restrictions, and laws whose original purpose has almost disappeared from memory. Some of these stories have been exaggerated over time, while others are based on genuine legislation that still exists in some form. And the strangest part is that a law does not necessarily have to be enforced every day to remain technically valid. So when people say Britain has bizarre laws, the real story is often much more complicated and much more interesting than the joke suggests. The reason these unusual laws survive is partly because British law has evolved in layers. Instead of constantly throwing away every old rule, the legal system has often allowed legislation to remain until Parliament decides that it should be repealed, replaced, or consolidated. This means that rules created for a completely different society can sometimes linger in the background, even when almost nobody thinks about them anymore. Imagine a world without smartphones, modern transportation, or even electric lighting, where certain behaviors made perfect sense to lawmakers. Now, move forward hundreds of years, and suddenly the same legal language sounds absurd. But there is an important distinction here. Some famous, weird British laws are actually myths, misinterpretations, or outdated summaries of more complicated regulations. The truth can be even more entertaining than the myth, because behind many of these strange rules is a story about disease, public order, medieval customs, royal power, or the simple difficulty of changing an enormous legal system. And this is where things start to get truly fascinating, because among the most famous examples is a law involving something that seems completely harmless: a fish. Yes, a fish. There is a genuine piece of British legislation that makes it an offense to handle a salmon in suspicious circumstances. The wording sounds like something from a comedy sketch, but it comes from a real law designed to tackle a very real problem. And once you understand why that phrase was written into British law, you begin to see the pattern behind many of these strange regulations. They were not created because lawmakers had nothing better to do. They were usually responses to specific problems that once mattered enormously. The bizarre part is that the circumstances changed, but the legal language remained. And if you think a suspicious salmon is strange, wait until you discover what British lawmakers were actually trying to stop. The infamous Salmon Law comes from the Salmon Act of 1986, a piece of legislation that was created to consolidate and modernize rules concerning salmon conservation and related offenses. Buried within its provisions is the wonderfully memorable phrase concerning the handling of salmon in suspicious circumstances. At first glance, it sounds as though British police officers might patrol rivers waiting for someone to glance nervously at a fish. But that is not what the law is really about. The wording is connected to the suspicion that a person may have obtained the salmon illegally, particularly through activities such as poaching or theft. In other words, the law is not really concerned with whether your behavior around a fish looks strange. It is concerned with whether the circumstances surrounding your possession of that fish suggest that something unlawful has happened. The phrase became famous because of its unusual wording, but behind the comedy is a serious attempt to combat illegal fishing and the trade in unlawfully obtained salmon. The history behind this is actually quite revealing. Salmon have long been valuable in Britain, and controlling access to fishing rights has been an important legal issue for centuries. In earlier periods, salmon fisheries could be economically significant, and illegal fishing could threaten both private interests and the sustainability of fish populations. Poaching was not simply a harmless prank. It could involve organized activity and cause serious damage to fisheries. This is why the law gave authorities the ability to consider the circumstances in which someone possessed a salmon. If a person was found with a fish under conditions that suggested illegal acquisition, the authorities could investigate. The unusual phrase essentially gave the law a memorable way of describing suspicious circumstances without requiring someone to be caught in the exact act of stealing the fish. So, technically, you are not going to be arrested merely because you look guilty while carrying a salmon home from the supermarket. The real issue is whether there are reasonable grounds to suspect that the fish was obtained unlawfully. But there is an even bigger lesson hidden inside this strange piece of legislation. Laws often sound ridiculous when we remove them from the historical problem they were designed to solve. The phrase, handling salmon in suspicious circumstances, became an internet sensation because it sounds like an absurd rule created by eccentric lawmakers. Yet the reality is far more practical. Britain was dealing with the theft and illegal capture of a valuable natural resource, and lawmakers needed language broad enough to address situations where the evidence might be circumstantial. The fish itself was never the real mystery. The mystery was how it got into your hands. And this is only the beginning. Because once you start looking through Britain's legal history, you find that some of the country's strangest rules are actually frozen snapshots of forgotten fears and ancient social problems. Rules that once protected public health, controlled dangerous behavior, or maintained social order can sound almost comical today. And in the next part, we are going much further back in time, to an era when Britain was governed by customs so old that some of them seem almost impossible to imagine in the modern world. To understand why Britain has accumulated so many strange laws, you have to travel back to a time when the country was almost unrecognizable compared with the world we know today. Imagine narrow streets filled with mud, open markets packed with traders, animals wandering through crowded towns, and communities where the local church bell could be more important than any clock. In medieval England, laws were often created to deal with very specific problems: maintaining order in busy markets, protecting property, controlling public behavior, and preventing disputes from turning into violence. The legal system was not one perfectly organized machine. It was a patchwork of royal decrees, local customs, parliamentary statutes, and common law that developed over centuries. Some rules disappeared naturally as society changed. Others were formally repealed, and a surprising number were simply absorbed into newer laws or left behind in legal history. That is why modern Britain can sometimes feel like it has a legal time capsule hidden beneath its surface. One of the most famous examples often mentioned in discussions about strange British laws is the idea that it is illegal to die in the Houses of Parliament. The story is repeated so often that it has become part of British folklore, but there is no specific law that actually makes dying inside Parliament illegal. The myth probably grew from the fact that the Palace of Westminster is a royal palace, combined with old assumptions about what would happen if someone became seriously ill there. Another popular claim suggests that it is illegal to wear a suit of armor in Parliament, which is closer to historical legislation. The statute forbidding bearing of armor in Parliament, passed in the 15th century, addressed the carrying of arms and armor in Parliament under specific circumstances. The modern image of someone walking into the chamber wearing medieval armor is hilarious, but the original concern was far more serious. In an era when political disputes could potentially become violent, restricting weapons inside Parliament was a matter of security. The strange thing is not necessarily that these rules existed. The strange thing is how easily their original context disappears, leaving behind stories that sound completely absurd. And then there are the laws and customs surrounding public order, where the line between history and modern reality becomes even more fascinating. Britain has long had regulations concerning behavior in public spaces, from disturbing the peace to obstructing roads and interfering with public officials. Many of these rules evolved from ancient concepts that were never intended to be entertaining. They were designed for crowded streets, horse-drawn vehicles, public markets, and communities where a single disturbance could quickly become a serious problem. Over time, transportation changed, cities expanded, and technology transformed everyday life, but the underlying legal principles often survived. This is why a modern person can sometimes encounter a rule that appears bizarre until you understand the world that created it. And if you think medieval Britain was the strangest chapter in this story, the next category may be even more surprising, because some of Britain's most unusual laws involve ordinary things people encounter every single day: food, animals, and the simple act of behaving badly in public. Now imagine going about your normal day in Britain and suddenly discovering that something as ordinary as eating, feeding an animal, or behaving in a certain way in public could potentially bring you into conflict with the law. Of course, the reality is rarely as dramatic as the internet makes it sound. Many famous claims about bizarre British food laws are exaggerated or completely false, but there are genuine regulations that can seem strange when viewed without context. Take the rules surrounding food safety, for example. Britain has extensive legislation governing the preparation, storage, sale, and handling of food. These laws exist for obvious reasons today, but some of their origins lie in centuries of concerns about contaminated products, fraudulent merchants, and dangerous food practices. In earlier times, people could not rely on modern refrigeration, laboratory testing, or standardized food production. A law that seems excessively specific today may have been created because someone, somewhere, discovered a very unpleasant problem the hard way. Animals create another fascinating category of unusual legal rules. Britain has a long history of regulating animals because they were once deeply connected to transportation, agriculture, trade, and public safety. Horses were essential for travel and commerce. Livestock could damage crops or create hazards in crowded streets. Dogs could cause injuries or spread disease. Even pigeons, depending on the circumstances, could become part of disputes involving property and public nuisance. This historical relationship between humans and animals explains why British law contains so many regulations that sound strangely specific when removed from their original setting. A modern city dweller might wonder why lawmakers ever needed to worry about animals in the street. But centuries ago, a runaway horse could cause chaos. A badly managed herd could destroy a farmer's livelihood, and an animal blocking a busy road could create a genuine public danger. The law was responding to everyday problems that have largely disappeared, or at least changed dramatically. Then there is the fascinating world of public behavior. Britain has laws against disorderly conduct, public nuisance, obstruction, and behavior that creates danger or serious disruption. These rules can sometimes produce stories that sound ridiculous when simplified into a single sentence. But the deeper principle is remarkably consistent. The law tries to balance individual freedom with the need for people to share public spaces peacefully. What makes British legal history so entertaining is the sheer variety of situations that lawmakers have encountered over the centuries. Some regulations deal with practical problems, others reflect social attitudes from another era, and some survive mainly because the legal system has never considered them important enough to remove. But there is one final question we need to answer. If these strange laws really exist, why aren't British police constantly arresting people for breaking them? The answer reveals the biggest misconception surrounding the entire subject, and it completely changes how you should think about Britain's weirdest laws. After hearing all these stories, it is tempting to imagine Britain as a country where unsuspecting citizens are constantly one bizarre mistake away from being arrested. But that is not how the legal system actually works. Many of the laws that appear strange today are either obsolete in practical terms, narrowly applicable, rarely enforced, or misunderstood when they are presented online. Some famous examples are outright myths. Others are genuine laws that address very specific circumstances that almost nobody encounters. And some are simply old pieces of legislation whose wording has survived even though the world around them has changed beyond recognition. This distinction is incredibly important because it separates the entertaining folklore of Britain's weird laws from the actual reality of British law. The truth is often less absurd, but in many cases, far more fascinating. What these laws really reveal is something much bigger about how societies evolve. Laws are created in response to problems, and when those problems disappear, the law does not always disappear with them. A rule might have been written because of a particular crime wave, a public health crisis, a dangerous technology, a political conflict, or a social custom that no longer exists. Centuries later, the original reason may be forgotten, while the words remain. That is how a legal system becomes a kind of historical archive. Every strange phrase can potentially tell us something about the people who wrote it and the fears they had. The suspicious salmon tells us about illegal fishing. Restrictions on weapons in Parliament remind us of a time when political violence was a genuine concern. Regulations surrounding animals reflect a society that depended heavily on them. And the myths about dying in Parliament or other supposedly bizarre rules demonstrate how easily historical details can transform into modern legends. So, are Britain's weirdest laws actually something to worry about? For most people, probably not. You are unlikely to find yourself in trouble because you accidentally behave suspiciously around a salmon or wandered into Parliament wearing medieval armor. But these stories are still worth exploring because they reveal something surprisingly human about the law itself. Laws are not created in a vacuum. They are written by people trying to solve the problems of their own time, and sometimes those solutions survive long after the original problem has vanished. The next time you hear someone claim that Britain has a law so strange it sounds completely made up, don't immediately believe it, and don't immediately dismiss it either. Look closer. Because behind the strangest legal stories, there may be a forgotten piece of history waiting to be uncovered. And perhaps that is the real mystery of Britain's weirdest laws. Not why they sound so ridiculous today, but what they can teach us about the world that existed when they were first written.